can everyone hear me? Yeah. For that beautiful and generous introduction. I'm so honored and happy to be here today. I want to thank Jeff Kahn and Susan Kisner for being incredibly welcoming and warm, for extending the invitation, as well as the co-sponsors. I want to thank all of you for being here despite the coronavirus. I know that's a little edgy these days. And I just want to say it's really a pleasure, it's really wonderful for me to see some of my beloved colleagues and friends out in the audience. I owe a special thanks to Cinda. As you got a little background, we've known each other since we were like barely out of girlhood, through pregnancies and everything. But it was Cinda who brought me into her project on moral distress. And it really exposed me to a kind of brand new literature, a brand new set of concerns. And it's been, I think, it's been a poignant journey for me because the issues are really profound. I'm just incredibly grateful, and I'm very grateful that you brought me on board on your project. I've learned a great deal from you. Also, a lot of what I'm going to say today comes directly out of the work that Cinda and I have done, especially the beginning of my remarks. So I want to kind of acknowledge that in advance, and I'm going to be referencing our work throughout. I'm going to begin by characterizing moral distress, and then I want to explore 4 themes that have anchored the prevailing discourse around moral distress. It's clear that when it comes to moral distress, we confront a very troubling picture. And yet I've posed the question in my title, whether this is a time for hope. And I was thinking kind of in the wake of like all this coronavirus frenzy, that I was very glad when I sent you my title that I put a question mark at the end of it. I do think the answer is yes, but I'll tell you in advance that I distinguish hope from optimism. I'll say more about that later, but I'm working broadly with an understanding of hope and hopefulness, not as confident, predictive expectation here that we could significantly ameliorate what has become an epidemic of moral distress, but rather as a positive, constructive orientation in pursuit of this desired outcome. And I believe that shifting to a more hopeful orientation not only is crucial, but it can also give us greater grounds for optimism that real progress can be made. So I'm not assuming background, and I want to begin by just a little bit of history. The term moral distress was first coined by Andrew Jameson almost 4 decades ago. And it was used to refer to the anguish and suffering, the frustration and outrage of nurses who found themselves betraying their own integrity or with imperiled integrity, feeling like their integrity was threatened under the force of institutional pressures and constraints. And though the initial focus was on the critical care nurses working in high-intensity settings, the decades of research that have followed since Jameson's early work, reveal that moral distress is actually a quite pervasive experience. It's also a growing reality for clinicians and health professionals across the spectrum of disciplines and roles. The concept itself has gotten a great deal of traction in the clinical bioethics literature. It's also become a rallying cry for clinicians. And I'm going to come back to this point because I actually think that is hopeful. That's my first kind of moment in discussing hope, is the fact that this has become a rallying cry. But the sad news is that an alarming number of clinicians report feeling besieged and disillusioned in healthcare systems that are permeated by moral failings that they feel powerless to change. So I think it's fair to say that moral distress has become an epidemic, and it's one that we know too often leads clinicians to experiences of helplessness and moral failure. Now, as a non-clinician, I want to say that moral distress is not unique to clinicians. It's a dimension of all moral life in the trenches. And the trenches can be our homes, they can be our neighborhoods, our families, our workplaces, are battlefields, both kind of symbolic or metaphorical and literal. But moral distress in the clinical context has a kind of electric urgency, I think, because not only because it's pervasive, but because we hold high expectations for the integrity of healthcare providers. Their work is inherently moral work. It's often high stakes work, and in many ways it's uniquely intimate work on the front lines with vulnerable people, many of whom are suffering and afraid, and who depend not only on the expertise and mastery, but also on the professional and personal moral integrity of those who care for them. So it's unconscionable, really, that we should ask clinicians to do their work under conditions that are so frequently experienced as challenging to or jeopardizing of their moral integrity. What more specifically is moral distress? How am I using the concept? One of the things that was really frustrating about confronting the morass of literature on moral distress is that there's so much inconsistency in how that term is used. So as we were working, as Cinda and I were working, we were thinking, well, maybe we need to get rid of the term altogether. Or maybe we need to kind of use a very narrow, kind of stipulated concept. You know? Or maybe we should just deploy a liberal, loose notion, a kind of inclusive notion. And we debated and decided it's important to retain the concept, because the concept has been a critical focal point in drawing attention to a kind of especially troubling kind of suffering. We also decided to use a fairly inclusive term, partly because we were drawing a lot of empirical literature, so that enabled us to set our scope fairly broadly. We could include data from studies that might have defined it in more narrow terms, but that we actually included within our definition. So moral distress, as I'm using the concept, and here I'm really almost quoting, paraphrasing work that we've already done, refers to forms of moral suffering tied to the experience of imperiled integrity. Paradigmatically, moral distress involves the anguished judgment that we have violated one of our own core value commitments, or in some other significant way fallen morally short under conditions of constraint or duress. These conditions can be social, they can be cultural, they can be institutional. But standardly for clinicians, they involve practices, protocols, policies, lines of authority that are imposed on the individual. And the details are various. Clinicians may experience their integrity is imperiled by resource constraints, by others in authority, by conflicts with patients or colleagues, or by policies they lack authority to override, just among some of the examples. Moral distress, at least as I'm using it here, does not always tie directly to a sense of personal or professional moral failure. So this is a sense in which the concept is somewhat broad. Sometimes it consists in moral uncertainty or anticipatory anxiety in the face of pressures or constraints we perceive as integrity threatening. It can also involve concerns about complicity in wrongdoing, about indirectly contributing to or supporting an ethical lapse, perhaps on the part of a team or an organization one works with. Crucially, moral distress emerges in the dynamic relationship between the individual and the systems in which the individual practices. So understanding and addressing moral distress requires attending to a multiplicity of relational and institutional factors as they interact and erode clinicians' experiences of integrity and moral agency. I don't have the coronavirus, I have allergies, and I was afraid my voice would give out. But that's good news because it's almost spring. Almost spring. Okay. Like other forms of moral suffering, moral distress can manifest in a wide array of states, including anguish, anxiety, guilt, frustration, grief, remorse, outrage, and shame. Long term, it's associated with things like depression, anxiety, burnout, physiological symptoms, physiological conditions like sleeplessness, gastro issues around just all the kinds of stress phenomena that emerge in the body. And though its sources are diverse, you can distill various themes, and I want to begin by highlighting 4 themes, 4 challenges really that lie at the heart of moral distress, each of which speaks to the toll it takes on a sense of moral efficacy and moral integrity. The first is what I'm going to call moral powerlessness. It's often tied to frustration and anger, and related to this, voicelessness, often leading to a sense of isolation. Then the cumulative dynamic nature of moral distress as it impacts moral responsiveness. And finally, what Cinda and I have called shame, or an ongoing apprehension of oneself as deficient, defective, and diminished. These challenges have figured centrally in the prevailing narrative around moral distress, and they're really helpful in thinking about constructive and hopeful avenues forward in addressing moral distress. So moral distress is painful, and it's hard, and it can be debilitating. But one of the things that's really important to note, and it's why I put the word hope in my title, is that the narrative, the prevailing narrative, the dominant narrative, continues to be quite negative and quite hopeless in its explicit kinds of analyses and so on. And I think that won't move us forward, although I think it's also really important in setting the groundwork. What are the challenges, right? What's the diagnosis so we can treat? So first, powerlessness. And here I want to share a case that I've written about and that Cinda and I have also included in 2 papers. It's a case that vividly captures the linked experiences of powerlessness and voicelessness. In a personal narrative of moral distress, Dr. Susan McCammon is writing in 2013, a surgical oncologist, describes her helplessness and outrage, immense and frightening, when she learns the institution where she practices has, in the wake of a damaging storm, it was Hurricane Sandy, terminated the care of its uninsured patients. She attempts to protest this decision, moving up the ladder of what she describes as the increasingly reticent and then elusive line of authority, finally accepting that she was powerless to combat the decision. While this decision was made by the administration, she writes, its enactment was delegated to the physicians. Thus, not only were we, the physicians, not involved in the decision, but we shouldered the burden of telling our patients that they would no longer be treated. Carrying out a decision she deems immoral, McCammon bears the brunt of her patients' terror, grief, and rage at being abandoned. And she grapples with new questions. Should she care for the insured patients in her practice, whose cancer she can, after all, treat? Should she instead become a reformer and advocate on the national scene? Because her organization was under stress. That's why they were canceling and letting go all these patients. But I don't do those things, she says. Instead, I hold hands and weep with patients and go home so very tired. I feel guilty for not taking up arms. Eventually, McCammon goes on to become board certified in hospice and palliative care medicine, incorporating this new set of expertise into her surgical practice. So she finds a way to align her training with her moral convictions, even while she continues to work in a system she believes is abandoning some of its most vulnerable patients. Yet she sees her story, and I just want to flag this language, she sees her story not as one of triumph and renewed strength, but of resignation and despair. The experience of powerlessness, of being caught and pressured to do what one believes to be wrong, or impeded in meeting moral commitments one takes to be fundamental, is a key theme in the experience of moral distress. The sense of powerlessness has many faces. The nurse who's so overrun by her patient load that she feels she can't provide safe and adequate care. The NICU team that for lack of alternatives, releases a still fragile infant into a social environment they deem inadequate. The nurses and physicians mandated by their hospital to treat a catastrophically brain-injured child when they believe doing so to be cruel and to, this is a quote, observe their own hands engaged in what they perceive as the unconscionable act of harming a child. The sense of powerlessness is often connected to the experience of being silenced or voiceless. And this can arise when moral concerns are devalued or disregarded, or when there simply doesn't seem to be an avenue for expressing and addressing them. So McCammon protests, for example, but meets with administrative resistance and evasion. In a different case, a clinician relates a morally troubling decision made in her clinical unit. Although I was an active member of the care team to be involved, I was relegated to being a quiet bystander, a technician to provide the skills, but not the critical reflection, which I still feel makes us physicians. A nursing student describes obeying her teacher's commands to remain silent about an act she witnessed. I finished out my rotation without a peep, but in doing so, I feel I betrayed the people in my life who have mental illnesses. I betrayed the belief in human rights, which had led me to healthcare in the first place. And I betrayed the patients who come to that hospital seeking help and compassion and are instead treated like criminals. When moral distress is tied to a sense of disempowerment and voicelessness, clinicians often feel frustrated, angry, helpless, and trapped, unable to alter or exit the situation without undue cost. The inability to voice moral protest and concern, especially in ways that would receive uptake and recognition and thus have potential to actually have impact, can contribute to what Warren Wright has evocatively called mute suffering, suffering that carries a keen sense of moral isolation and sometimes also of estrangement and alienation. It's important to note that moral distress does not always trace to discrete and identifiable moral crises or conflicts that stand out in awareness or even in memory. It can emerge more gradually, beginning with vague moral discomfort or the dawning awareness of moral compromises being made, perhaps under pressure to cut corners or to perform interventions for which someone is not adequately trained. And this is important because it can make it more challenging to notice and to address moral distress before it escalates in destructive ways. And moral distress does escalate. So that's the next kind of challenge on the table. Webster and Bayless in 2000 coined the term moral residue to capture the dynamic, long-lasting effects of unresolved moral distress carried into new situations. Epstein and Hamrick have documented what they call the crescendo effect, which is actually kind of famous now, famous term. When new distressing situations occur, or when certain kinds of triggers of distress are repeated, as they often are, the impact can be cumulative, elevating the baseline of somatic and emotional dysregulation. There's testimony, compelling testimony in the moral distress literature, speaking to the challenges of overwhelming arousal, leading to familiar patterns of fight or avoidance, abandonment of patients or colleagues. Flight. Fight expressed in anger, contentiousness, cynicism, sometimes also in communication breakdowns or entrenched conflicts and damaged trust. And freeze, or the emotional numbing, disengagement, sometimes leading to disconnected, even a kind of robotic, as one person in the narrative put it, robotic task orientation. Clinicians suffering from sustained or persistent moral distress will often lament that they are simply going through the motions, or have lost heart, or just don't care anymore. Whether dramatic or gradual, moral distress needs to be detected and worked with in an ongoing and proactive way, or it can take on a dynamic of its own, spiraling in ways that further disrupt moral composure and effectiveness and diminish moral resilience that's necessary for compassionate care of patients. That is, moral distress can itself become a moral liability. And when it does, the distress, the moral distress, is compounded, is often compounded. So this brings me to shame. Chronic, unmitigated, or repeated experiences of moral distress can generate an ongoing sense of deficiency, of what Sandra Bartke, in a very different context, identifies as a form of shame, to quote her, manifest in a pervasive sense of personal inadequacy, a species of psychic distress occasioned by a self or a state of self apprehended by the person themselves as defective or in some way diminished. Conscientious clinicians may respond with especially acute shame to their own moral distress, especially when it does lead to diminished moral responsiveness or protective forms of moral disengagement, and they consider these to be moral failings for which they're responsible. Bartke highlights what she calls the corrosive impact of shame, tied to its profoundly disempowering drive for secrecy and concealment. Shame fears exposure, and fear of exposure and of negative appraisal can contribute to resigned, silent suffering. The experiences of powerlessness, of voicelessness, of emotional depletion, and of shame can induce a sense of loss and disillusionment, alienation from aspirations that once informed one's professional identity and grounded one's engagement in purposeful and trusting collaboration with colleagues. It can be increasingly difficult to sustain moral confidence, courage, and hope. So the challenges of moral distress, the forms of suffering and damage it involves, are deeply troubling. You know, and when I step back and I think about the term moral distress, honestly, it sounds like a euphemism to me. It just feels like a euphemism. The ethicist Nancy Berlinger puts it really beautifully. She says, moral distress is a polite sounding term for what is often a wrenching experience. And though it has been researched and explored and analyzed for now almost 4 decades, what we see is not really significant progress, but escalation, and what might rightly be called a moral crisis of epidemic proportions. Which brings me to my title. Okay, is this a time for hope? Can we or should we be hopeful that we might work with moral distress and with the systemic factors contributing to it? That we might seek ways to better support clinicians' ability to work with integrity, even within the complex and demanding context of clinical environments. And as I said at the outset, I do believe this is a time for hope. The answer to the question, I think, is actually yes, an emphatic yes. But the question that I want to ask isn't whether there are grounds for hope, but whether we should, in addressing moral distress, take a hopeful stance. And here it's helpful to distinguish, as I hinted that I would, hope from optimism. So to be optimistic is to believe that the probabilities or prospects for realizing a desired outcome are good. Optimism involves confident, predictive expectation in the likelihood of what is sought. But hope, even ardent hope, is something we can sustain when we're pessimistic about the prospects of success or deeply uncertain about them. To hope, as I'm using that term, is to desire an outcome and to believe that outcome is possible, but not inevitable and not certain. But more than that, and what is key, is that in hoping, we orient toward the positive possibility of what we hope for. We see the future as open to what is hoped for, what is desired or sought. And we set our sight on the positive possibility. To the extent that we're hopeful, our agency is mobilized around this possibility, rather than stymied by doubt or anxiety, cynicism or despair. So hopefulness can open up a space for experimentation, for creative vision. It can energize constructive action. Crucially, the hopefulness that I'm talking about can't be a kind of Pollyanna hope, or the hope of cheery denial. Hope entails a realistic mobilizing of our agency in the face of limitation, challenge, or constraint. In this sense, it's different from wishing, fantasizing, or magical thinking. So as Margaret Walker puts it, I can wish I could fly, or wish I could be 5 years old again. I do sometimes. Hoping, by contrast, requires some presumption of probability, however slight. It also engages our agency, whereas wishing, longing, fantasizing can be, as Walker puts it, an entirely spectator sport. We mark the difference, she says, between wishing and hoping, precisely by noting whether individuals seek and explore routes to achieving the end sought. Hope doesn't merely have an illusory agency. Hope is displayed in a variety of actual exercises, expressions, and activities by hopeful agents. So I want to suggest there are routes, to use that word, opening up in addressing moral distress. Routes that are expressive of hopeful agency. And my question again is less whether there are grounds for hope in the sense of optimism, but rather what, and here I want to say what hope looks like in this context. I think it's true we must and we should address moral distress from a stance of hope. But what does it look like? And here I want to just share a few brief reflections. So first, the very fact that moral distress has become a rallying point among clinicians and a focal point of a huge cottage industry of lively research and analysis is itself, I think, an embodiment of hope and also a reason for some optimism. Our growing understanding of moral distress as a distinctive phenomenon and the increasing recognition that it affects clinicians and health professionals across disciplines and roles both mark important advancements. And this is really key. They mark important advancements which bring moral distress out of the shadows of private individual experience, where it too often is tied to feelings of deficiency and shame, to silent suffering. You know, I think of the analogy to the Me Too movement, right? There's been this rallying around this focal point that brings it into the public arena. So of course it's felt still on a private level, so is moral distress. But there's a kind of powerful collective acknowledgement of this unseen, a kind of under-recognized, but completely familiar set of experiences. I believe it's hopeful that moral distress has been named and been the subject of extensive negative diagnostic work. Work that, to be sure, emphasizes the mostly systemic problems and forms of adversity and damage that generate moral distress. Because now we're in a position to begin to formulate positive normative recommendations, working aspirations, or what we can think of as practical hopes, that can guide innovative efforts to change and reform systems and cultures of practice so that they can better support clinicians' integrity and resilience. More radically, I guess, in terms of the reflection on this prevailing discourse, despite the negative narrative around moral distress, I think that the concerns that are being articulated and the investment in the issue are themselves expressions of hope. Hope that we can see the dangers and thus do better. This brings me to a second point, and it's also a normative recommendation. And this is, I think, one of the most important shifts that occurred when Cinda and I were working together. And I remember when it hit us even, just the insight just struck. But we need to seek a positive reorientation in the way moral distress is itself understood and thought about. We must shift from the prevailing negative narrative in which moral distress is so persistently tied to a sense of moral failing and shame. It's crucial to recognize that moral distress is not itself the problem. It's not a symptom of moral deficiency or failure or weakness. In fact, it's an expression of integrity. In the language that Cinda and I have used, moral distress is most fundamentally an expression of conscientious moral concern, of fidelity to moral commitments that are experienced as imperiled and compromised. It's a troubled call of conscience. Heeding this call, sustaining integrity, even under conditions of moral pressure, conflict, and constraint, requires being able to stand for and give voice to commitments and values. And having a voice, being able to assert appraisals, raise concern, protest meaningfully, with background trust that one's perspective counts and can have impact, is crucial to overcoming the sense of moral powerlessness, voicelessness, and isolation so often tied to moral distress. And understanding this can provide insight into how we might support clinicians' effective moral agency and integrity, among other things, by creating safe and responsive environments in which they can give voice to conscience in meaningful ways. As Margaret Walker argues in her book Moral Repair, when people stop feeling anger, when they stop expressing, and I'm paraphrasing here, they're bits of quote, when people stop feeling anger, when they stop expressing concern or moral protest, this, she says, can reveal a troubling resignation or normative surrender. Expressions of moral anger, of moral concern, moral protest, and also moral confusion, moral uncertainty, convey the conviction that one is in a position to assert standards and norms that should be shared, to insist on the validity and importance of moral commitments and values that have been violated, betrayed, or otherwise forsaken. Understood in this way, expressions of moral distress are not mere complaints or laments. They're not just expressions of suffering, of unpleasant interior emotional states. They're assertions of concern. And in this sense, then, they're also expressions of hope, or they can be seen as expressions of hope, because they point beyond what is to what ought to be. And this isn't to say that when you express moral distress, if you're being recognized not as just expressing suffering, which is also important, but as asserting protest or asserting moral concern, that there's an expectation everyone will agree with you. Of course there's not. But once we see the expressions of moral distress as assertions, they enter the space of reason. And once they're in the space of reason in a way that just, I feel bad or I feel angry, is really just a first personal report. Once assertions of moral protest enter the space of reasons, they can be taken up, they can be debated, they can be contested, they can be negotiated. That's where we can begin, right, to make sense of the protest. So tapping into the constructive potential of moral distress can offer an important response to the sense of powerlessness that it carries. But this really requires, again, a context in which the constructive potential of moral concern is recognized and protest can be safely and creatively considered and taken up. This brings me to a third reflection. I just want to check my time. The challenges of moral distress invite us, I think, to think more fully about what is entailed by moral integrity. What do we mean when we talk about sustaining meaningful moral integrity? I think we often operate with what I think of as a warrior model of integrity. We think of integrity as tied to perseverance, resoluteness, being stalwart in the face of adversity and securing alignment between our actions and our moral commitments and convictions, being able to withstand temptations and pressures, withstand forces of corruption and needs for compromise. But integrity often involves careful moral compromise. Moral distress in all its forms confronts us with the brute limitations of our control. It highlights our vulnerability to the choices and conduct of others, to the systems of practice and the institutional structures and policies within which we live and work. And this reality suggests we would be wise to abandon what the philosopher and my teacher, Norman Care, calls the myth of the in-control agent. This myth and the pressures on clinicians to be heroic can render clinicians especially susceptible to moral distress. Yielding a harsh and perfectionistic understanding of personal moral accountability and integrity might constitute another hopeful, positive step in overcoming moral distress. And this isn't to suggest complacency or apathy, but a thoughtful and principled consideration of the limitations of our own power and the limitations of our own control. As McCammon, the surgical oncologist that you met earlier, writes of her eventual adjustment to the moral constraints of her situation, and I love it. She says, "I was learning to do what I could, even when I couldn't do what I felt like I should." In a constructive or positive sense, we might embrace a picture on which sustaining integrity, as Wendy Austin suggests, involves more than a single-minded focus on one's own moral agency, especially in contexts that are inherently collaborative, like clinical contexts are. Being ethical, this is quoting her, Austin, involves responsiveness to others, a recognition of the messy interdependence of decisions, interests, and persons. In such contexts, exercising moral agency is not centrally a matter of independent, resolute, individual effort, but of collaborative engagement in forging paths that are walked together and shaped in ongoing ways through shared collective endeavors. And this is a description of the work of hope. Writing about hope in the context of moral resilience, Cinda has argued that hope, involves, quote, the ability to interpret moral adversity in a way, I'm slightly paraphrasing here, in a way that mobilizes a constructive or positive mindset, rather than a detrimental or negative one. In cases involving threats to integrity, we can attune to the distress and despair and disable our ability to perceive the more promising or less harmful moral choices. Notice that's tied to compromise. What's the more promising? We should do lots of things. What's the more promising? Or all the options stink. What's the least harmful? But mental and emotional buoyancy, or hope, allows us to acknowledge the difficulties and threats, but to shift our focus to finding principled solutions. A positive mindset unleashes the energy to regain or sustain moral agency instead of being permanently depleted, dispirited, or disengaged. It allows one to rebound, reorient, and continue to serve. There's no question that in addressing the epidemic of moral distress and innovative efforts on the front lines of clinical practice, the individual and the focus on the individual will be just one piece of the picture. As Cinda and Monica Sharma argue, key is going to be finding scalable interventions and taking what they call a rich, broad spectrum approach. This is focused not just on individual actors or teams, not just on organizations, but on the broad array of stakeholders, agents, and forces that constitute the dynamic phenomena that together make up what we call healthcare. We must ask, Sindha and Sharma say, how are the values, norms, and strategic priorities embodied from the bedside to the boardroom? And how are the healthcare practices and institutions themselves nested in broader societal contexts? Questions of culture, but also of law, regulation, policy, budgets. Because moral distress emerges, as I said earlier, in the dynamic relationship between the individual clinician and the systems in which they practice. Addressing moral distress will thus require attending to multiplicity of relational, organizational, institutional, cultural factors as they interact both in eroding or in supporting clinicians' experiences of moral agency and integrity. To succeed, and here again I'm quoting Rushton and Sharma, to succeed, solutions must be designed to help people innovate, generate breakthroughs, and sustain the specific changes needed in shifting the culture to an integrity-supportive system. In closing, it's crucial that clinicians have courage to act with integrity and with fortitude. Yet, Hamrick, Aris, and Moorman have recently argued that asking clinicians to be courageous is asking too much, especially if the courage is needed because of ongoing institutional injustices and problems. Burdens individual clinicians, they argue, should not have to bear and cannot alone redress. I think there's something very important to this worry. And I think that the challenges of moral distress indicate that we need to find wisdom on both sides of this issue. Individual clinicians do need moral courage. And institutional opportunities are also needed through which they and other healthcare professionals at all levels of power and authority can give courageous voice to matters of conscience without fear of resistance, dismissal, reprisal, and with a realistic hope that their constructive protests and creative ideas can spur the progress and the reform that's so badly needed. As Walker puts it, hope can draw us into more reflective understanding and imaginative testing of what we want and what that shows about who we are. Hope holds open spaces in our awareness of ourselves and our worlds, spaces we can fill experimentally, but not idly, with possibilities that we value. Our inhabiting these spaces of positive possibility is both valuable instrumentally and valuable in itself. It is good to hope. It is enormously important that human beings have prodigious resources of imagination, invention, insight, and resistance that can open spaces of possibility and images of agency, even under desperate conditions. Thank you.
Questions? Comments?
Carse.
So thank you. I always love to hear you talk. I think I have a pretty basic question about moral distress, and the way you kind of carried it through your conversation made it clear to me as you went. So I spend a lot of time talking to clinicians, and I'm not always sure for myself whether I'm asking them to stand up and do the right thing, or whether I'm feeling bad for them because of the situation they're in, and asking that we demand to restructure the situation so that they're not in this crappy situation, right? And so when you talk about the idea that folks who are victims of moral distress can't live up to their obligations, I wonder about the can't, right? Is it that there's something that makes it literally impossible in these situations, or that it's too hard, that it would be unreasonable to expect us to live up to their expectations? Because sometimes I can't always tell for myself whether I'm thinking it would be unreasonable for me to expect them to be heroic, is one of the words you use, or whether it's actually just a top-down decision made that they don't have any control over at all. Because those seem like different sorts of circumstances. Does that make sense?
Yes, it's a great question. Now, I'm supposed to repeat it.
Oh, God.
Yeah, so basically, as I hear you, you're asking about the picture we have when someone experiences themselves as unable, use the word unable, so can't, that they experience themselves as not being able to live up to their own moral, kind of live in alignment or to act in alignment with their own moral convictions. And you're asking whether it's always that they can't, or rather that it's hard. And I think that can vary. It's surely the case that when our integrity is imperiled, and when clinician integrity is imperiled, there's an extremely high price tag that is perceived as attaching to doing what one thinks is right. And that price tag might be the job itself, and if you have dependents, that's a huge issue. Or it could be more moderate. It could be, the prospects of a promotion, or being written into a grant. And maybe what I hear you saying is when does courage count as heroic and when doesn't it? Is that what you're asking?
Maybe.
Right.
It was an ill-formed question, but
I
yeah,
don't
it's
think
asking you
so.
to talk about all of this, that space where inability runs into just difficult. I have less sympathy if it's just hard, because
Yes.
then you want to be, your response wants to be like, look, sometimes it's hard to be good. So yeah, when the hard goes into unable, like when it goes from being like, you should feel guilty because you're kind of a bad person, versus,
Yeah.
like this is a morally distressful situation because you just can't live up to your own standards.
Yeah, I mean, I think if there's a reason why a lot of the moral distress literature emerged first in the realm of nursing, because healthcare professions are hierarchical, and they're people who wield authority over other people. And very often, right, moral distress emerges when one simply doesn't have the authority to defy, a protocol or a call, to stop, a resuscitation, or refuse to do something one sees as kind of prolonging a life unnecessarily in a way that just induces unnecessary suffering. So if one's actually literally unable to wield authority, then in those circumstances, and often, the circumstances are pressing. The resuscitation is going on now, the order just came down, I've got 2 other patients, then yeah, I think it's something on the order of can't. In the sense of the escalating moral distress, where there's a persistent experience of moral compromise, one could say, well, then become a whistleblower or decide you're going to quit the job. And that, that's in the offing, and that's when being moral, sustaining integrity gets hard, but isn't impossible, right? But if the stakes are high of doing that, and not much is going to change as a result of doing that, except that you'll keep your own hands clean, I think that decision can be really, really complicated. And we focus so much on the individual, and one of the big messages of the literature that I think is really important is that it's always the individual within a system, and so the way forward is going to have to be really protecting people's ability to speak from conscience, and to track the protests and to incorporate a lot of players into the reforms that are needed within institutions. That's why I say kind of across the spectrum of power and authority. But I do think it emerges most saliently under circumstances where one simply doesn't have the authority to defy an order or to stop an order, even if one defies it oneself. Yeah. And that sounds like can't to me. Yeah.
I thought I did a better job of teaching Travis about what the pressures are in the clinical situation. I guess I have work to do. The talk was very thought-provoking, but also seems to me to be placing more of the burden for dealing with this at the individual level. And when you take it into the burnout space where we talk about go do yoga, go have a better lifestyle, make sure you make time for yourself, we put the solution to the problem on the individual, when the problem is a fundamental societal and institutional problem. And I believe a lot of it starts in the budget and C-suite, where decisions are made about how to staff and how to use resources that wind up with nurses and nurses saying, I'm afraid I'm going to lose my license if I have to continue under these circumstances. To some extent, I think hope is sort of the opiate of the masses in a way, because it's giving a false sense that they have an opportunity to change this. Ultimately, the change will happen when the C-suite realizes that patients are being harmed as a result of burnout, moral distress, the attitudes of the patient. And off the top of my head, I wonder if any studies have been done to see whether there are more intentional harms being caused by just morally distressed workers, or that it has some kind of specific impact in the workplace. You know, to me, moral distress, like R.D. Lang said about insanity, it's a moral reaction to an immoral situation
Yes,
that
it is.
workers are placed in.
I totally agree.
And I believe at the C-suite, where they're making millions of dollars in compensation, is the first place to begin to change the institutions. Just one more point I'll make, and this was such a striking thing. A few years ago, there was a paper talking about where do nurse executives fit into the solution to this problem. And there was a paper that talked about the fact that nurse executives have a great deal of moral distress, and a lot of it is around sexual harassment in the C-suite that they observe, or sexual harassment in the institutions that they observe. This is a fundamentally damaged system that can only be fixed by starting at the top and at the societal level, when patients and society is outraged about it.
So, I mean, in some sense, I agree. So, the statement, I'll say the statement, yes, so a very strong statement that by focusing on the individual clinician, or, you know, the kind of bedside practices and pressures and so on, if I hear you right, one is simply victimizing those who don't really have power to institute any kind of significant institutional change. And then the real problem lies at the institutional level. And so those who occupy the kind of the positions in the board, the C-suite, you know, the corporate leaders, really bear the moral brunt. You know, and there are many ways in which I agree with you about that. There are a few things I want to say. I would want to resist the view that you expressed at the very end, that it's really the C-suite that should be taking the lead on this. I think it has to be a collaboration from bottom up and from top down. And that's because those who are on the front lines know what's needed. They can speak to the changes and the reforms that are so essential. And I think it would be very unfortunate if they were just kind of erased out of the picture in terms of shaping policy, shaping practice, shaping the incentive structures, the budgetary priorities of institutions. So I would want to see a coordinated effort, and something that Cinda works on in her book, in the very later chapters in this broad spectrum approach, is thinking about, I think you use the word bridge, but anyway, I picture a bridge in my mind. How do we build institutional bridges, communicative, collaborative bridges at various levels of organization? And one suggestion that I thought was fascinating was building in concerns about moral distress, building them into ethics committees, which then have an ear with the C-suite, so that some of the concerns can actually get transmitted up the ladder, and then changes can actually be informed, by lived experience on the front lines. But I just want to say something else, which is, I actually think, so this view that if we just talk about mindfulness practice and so on, we're in effect putting the onus on those who in the end already don't have power. I actually think we need to be careful, because one of the things that seems pretty clear is that moral distress will never be eliminated. We will never have clinicians working in perfect institutions. And so that's the ongoing reality. It's certainly the reality now. And so I think saying, well, go meditate, go take care of yourself. If you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen, do something. That's one thing. but thinking about the ways we can build space into our institutions. Space that is supportive of certain kinds of skills that can help people achieve equilibrium, help people's resilience, kind of grow and flourish. So that there's leadership involved, there's actually institutionalized space, there are resources devoted to it. That feels very different from just abandoning, the clinicians on the front line and saying, the problem in here is in you. Because they are working on the front lines in imperfect institutions. And I think we can have institutional resources that support them on those front lines as we try, to reform the institutions at the same time. So I would want to resist that, and one of the things Cinda and I have argued is that part of the picture should be finding ways to support and nurture and strengthen resilience. That can't take the place of justice, but it's needed now because the situation is really tough right now, and that can be given institutional space. So I think what you're saying is very powerful, that without the leadership, nothing's going to happen. Not much is going to happen. Not enough.
Do we have time for one more? No?
One really, really short one. Try. I guess thanks very much. For me, throughout your talk, I was, in my mind, sort of replacing the word clinician in hospital with a whole lot of other institutions, and thinking there are a lot of institutions where distress is sort of present and significantly present. Political institutions, legal institutions, right? There are all sorts of hierarchical systems, individuals who are vulnerable in hierarchical societies, right? So to what extent do you see, the health system as sort of a unique case example of something, or if this is really just a phenomenon that captures a whole lot of other areas?
Yeah, so the question is, if we acknowledge the fact that moral distress is it's a challenge that traverses many different domains, professional and personal domains, which I totally agree with. That's one of the reasons it's really fascinating to me. I mean, the fact it's a euphemism, put that aside, I actually think, it captures the predicament of most of us who work in systems with limited power and limited authority. And then the second part of the question is, well then, is there something unique about the clinical setting? And I mean, I think one of the ways in which the clinical setting is unique, and I tried to speak to it a little bit in the beginning, is that the stakes are so high, the moral stakes are so high, that clinicians work on the front lines with people that are extremely vulnerable. There's often, sometimes it's life and death situations, but situations that are marked by profound dependency, and also real asymmetries of expertise and knowledge and dependency. So there's a lot of vulnerability in that context. And I also think I think of it as an arena in which there's an unusual degree of intimacy. Not intimacy as between partners or children and their parents, but intimacy in the sense that we are exposed in our rawness and our dependency when we're ill. So it feels extremely indecent to me that we shouldn't care more about the degree to which those professionals in whose care we place ourselves and must, right, are under assault, that they experience their very integrity to be imperiled. It's also so widespread, it's shocking. I mean, in the literature, you can even see it in, clergy that work in hospital settings, pharmacists, social workers, the spectrum of physicians. So it's nursing too, but so widespread. And that speaks to something being really wrong. But I do think there's a kind of electric urgency when it comes to the clinical environment because of the moral stakes of that work. Yeah.
So let's thank Alicia.